All right, we're live, so they tell me, okay? Looks like Alex and Robert pulled a save in the back. There was a threat of having no slides for class, and they were able to figure it out. So thankful for them, as always, and their good work. Let's jump into our study of Jeremiah, and we didn't quite finish. Really only got about 3/5 of the way through our lesson from Wednesday. And so we will spend some time picking up where we left off in Jeremiah 22. Real quickly, to repeat something from Wednesday, remember I sent handouts out for members of Bel Air via email. And so there was a handout sent out Wednesday that we're going to be continuing until we finish today and move on to the one that I sent out yesterday. So starting on number 19, and then we'll pick up with number 20 soon. But also remember that there was a handout I sent Wednesday called the list of Judah's last kings. And we're still in the section talking about the kings. And so if you have that, you want to reference that or maybe pull it up somehow. Again, I'm going to have some slides to diagram some of this because it is a little bit confusing, especially with all the names sounding similar and there being multiple names for different kings. It is confusing. So I'll show you some diagrams, but this chart, this is just a listing, along with the diagrams, hopefully can help you. And as we talk about each of these, you can find them on your sheet for a little bit of background or reminder of who these guys were. Okay, speaking of, we are talking about, as we said in the sermon, the history of Israel. But remember with Jeremiah and all of this that has happened in Israel's history, Jeremiah is right at the tail end of Judah's time in the land before they are taken into Babylonian captivity. And remember, Jeremiah is prophesying for a good amount of time, maybe 40 years or so, or close to that. And a portion of that is under King Josiah. And then the rest of that is Josiah's sons, who also reign as kings. And so let's remind ourselves of all of that, and again, try to make some sense of what's going on here. So Josiah is king for about 30 years, and remember that he is a good king. He implements reforms in the temple and in worship, but his final decision is a foolish one when he goes out to try to get involved in a fight that's not his. And so, although Pharaoh doesn't want to kill him, well, I guess he wants to, he did, but wasn't intending to confront Josiah. He kills him at the Valley of Megiddo, and Josiah dies, and his son Jehoahaz, and Shallum is his other name. I think that's on your sheet there. Now I got too many papers, try to keep up with everything. But Jehoahaz, his son, takes over very briefly, 3 months. And Pharaoh doesn't like him as king, and so he removes him. And Josiah's other son, Jehoiakim, who we will talk quite a bit about today as we finish up chapter 22, he has a longer reign. You see that because he is kind of put in place by Egypt. He serves Egypt for a while, and then ultimately Babylon comes to power, and Jehoiakim is a servant of Babylon for a while. And it is during this time that Daniel and his friends and the other first wave captives are taken to captivity into Babylon, and eventually Jehoiakim will rebel against Babylon and not get the punishment himself, but he will die, and then Jehoiachin, his son, becomes king. And it seems like this is when Nebuchadnezzar takes revenge for Jehoiakim's rebellion, and so Jehoiachin is only king for about 3 months before he is taken into captivity. And that means the second wave of captives, including the likes of Ezekiel, and really more of kind of the everyday people, and only a few are left in the land or in Jerusalem. And then Nebuchadnezzar puts Zedekiah, who is, again, Jehoiachin's uncle, and Josiah's other son. He becomes king, and it is during at the end of his 11 years of kind of being a king, but really just being a puppet of Nebuchadnezzar, that he decides to rebel. And Nebuchadnezzar holds nothing back this time and destroys the city of Jerusalem and takes basically everybody else that there is into captivity. Okay, so again, this is relevant because we're in a section of Jeremiah where Jeremiah is referring to these kings and talking about them. So we had a section that we ended with on Wednesday in chapter 22, 10 to 12, where God, through Jeremiah, says, don't weep for Josiah who has died, but really the one you want to weep for, who's really in a bad spot, is Jehoahaz. Remember, the son of Josiah that briefly took over for him because he was removed by Pharaoh, taken into captivity in Egypt, or taken as prisoner into Egypt. And the message, the prediction about Jehoahaz, or Shalom, is that he will be not return, and he will die in Egypt. Just real quickly, just remember that the messages in Jeremiah are not chronological. It's one of the things that makes Jeremiah, make it hard to read or hard to interpret, that things are out of order. So remember that earlier in chapter 21, there was like a conversation with Zedekiah, which is like 20 years later, or could be as many as 20 years later. But now we have this prediction about Jehoahaz. So I guess this could be later. Maybe people were still, uncertain about Jehoahaz's fate a decade later. I don't think so. Seems like this is an earlier prophecy here about Jehoahaz's fate and how he will not return to Israel, not return to Judah. And speaking of that, we move on to a prophecy about Jehoiakim. Okay, and as we'll see, this is during Jehoiakim's lifetime. Clearly in this passage. So we are definitely earlier than Zedekiah here, because we are in Jehoiakim, who was the son of Josiah, who was put on the throne by Pharaoh and will eventually serve Nebuchadnezzar in the time of the first wave of captives. So with all that said, let's read 13 to 23 through verse 23. And even if you're, lost with who all these kings are and their names and everything, I think the message for this king should be pretty easy to pick up on what he is being rebuked or condemned for. And I actually think it's really poignant even for us today. Jeremiah 22, verse 13, "Woe to him who builds his house without righteousness, and his upper rooms without justice, who uses his neighbor's services without pay, and does not give him his wages, who says, I will build myself a roomy house with spacious upper rooms, and cut out its windows, paneling it with cedar, and painting it bright red. Do you become a king? Do you become a king because you are competing in cedar? Did not your father eat and drink and do justice and righteousness? Then it was well with him. He pled the cause of the afflicted and needy. Then it was well. Is not that what it means to know me? Declares the Lord. But your eyes and your heart are intent only upon your own dishonest gain, and on shedding innocent blood, and on practicing oppression and extortion. Therefore, thus says the Lord in regard to Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, they will not lament for him, alas, my brother, or alas, my sister. They will not lament for him, alas, for my master, or alas, for his splendor. He will be buried with a donkey's burial, dragged off and thrown out beyond the gates of Jerusalem. Go up to Lebanon and cry out. Lift up your voice in Bashan. Cry out from Abarim, for all your lovers have been crushed. I spoke to you in your prosperity, but you said, I will not listen. This has been your practice from your youth, that you have not obeyed my voice. The wind will sweep away all your shepherds, and your lovers will go into captivity. Then you will surely be ashamed and humiliated because of your wickedness. You will dwell in Lebanon, nested in the cedars. How you will groan when pangs come upon you, like a woman in childbirth." Okay, do you see what the message is for Jehoiakim? Again, I think this is really powerful and really important, again, even for us. You read those first few verses, and you see that it is not until verse 18 that we learn that this is about Jehoiakim. He just begins by generally saying, woe to you who are doing these things. And then he says, your father reigned in righteousness, but you do this. And then he finally, in verse 18, calls out Jehoiakim by name as being the one that's being addressed. But what was Jehoiakim's view of being king? This is pretty common, I guess, in world history. Even I'm sure it's true today of presidents and world leaders and people of any kind of power or authority in society. For Jehoiakim, what did it mean to be a king? Well, you get to have a really big house, and you get to have the nicest house of anyone. You get to drive the fanciest cars and have the nicest chariots, right? 4 horsepower chariots. And, you look the part. That's what it was about for Jehoiakim. Looking the part without really the substance of what it means to be king. And we talked about this before, so we won't belabor the point. Remember that the emphasis of this section, as we've been talking about the kings, the emphasis is on justice and righteousness. That's what David was. Remember that reference back to, I think it's 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 15. David ruled by administering justice and being fair and honest and looking out, as David always did, for the oppressed, for the helpless, the orphan, the widow, etc. That's what it means to be a king. But Jehoiakim just really wanted to have the nicest palace on the block. Verse 15, I love, right? Do you become a king because you were competing in cedar, right? Is that how? Oh, you were king because you have the nicest house. No, you see how that's getting things backward. And he refers to Josiah and says that your father, he did justice and righteousness. We've talked about that Josiah was really more than maybe any other king, a David-like king. But Jehoiakim is only intent on dishonest gain. Speaking of dishonest gain, because you can see how a king would have opportunity to enrich himself, fraudulently or through oppression of others. Remember a story like Ahab, who had access to probably, more riches than anybody in the kingdom, and yet next door was that Naboth, and Naboth had a great vineyard, and so Jezebel said, well, you're the king, just go take it. That was Jehoiakim, or something like that, it seems. A total departure from his father. Interestingly, on this point, earlier in the text, it says that he was building his house without righteousness. He was building his upper rooms without justice. He used his neighbor's services without paying for it. Just as a kind of a quick note, right? That never happens today, right? That people really want to have a nice house. They really want to have a nice car because it makes them look a certain way, but even though they can't afford it, they've been given this little piece of plastic that allows them to play the part of being an important person in society with their fancy stuff. But they really can't afford it. They don't pay for it. And that's actually what Jehoiakim was doing, expanding his palace without being able to pay for it because he wanted to look like a great person, but he in fact was not a great person. But that kind of thing never happens today. Of course, none of us would ever do anything like that. So we'll move on here. The punishment for Jehoiakim is actually pretty striking, pretty severe, and maybe would be startling for a king of Judah. He's going to die without really any sort of honor. Okay, it's interesting that when you go read in 2 Kings 24, it says that he slept with his fathers, Jehoiakim. But it doesn't necessarily explicitly say, like it does of other kings, that he was buried with his fathers, okay? So, I don't know if we want to make too much of that, but the prophecy here is that Jehoiakim won't be buried. He'll, maybe you had a donkey as a kid that you really loved, and so when your donkey died, you gave him a proper burial, but I think most people, a donkey dies, you drag it out, throw it in a ditch somewhere, let the animals take care of it. He says he'll be given a donkey's burial, and there will be no one to mourn for him. But this is the point, right? That in the rest of these verses here, we see that Jehoiakim, the royal house in general, they were very secure in themselves. Remember, we saw this earlier in the chapter. In verse, where is it? In verse 22, he says, go up to Lebanon and cry out. And you think, well, I thought the king lived in Judah or in Jerusalem. right? And then in 23, he says, you dwell in Lebanon, you're nested in cedars. Remember that there's part of that is a reference to the palace being built with cedar wood. And so Jehoiakim would be nested in his cedars, very secure because he's in this nice palace, okay? Seems like also he talks about, your lovers that you turn to. Could be other gods, could be alliances that they're making with other nations, thinking that will make them secure. Whatever it is, we've seen this message throughout the book. They're so secure, the royal house, the kings of Judah, so secure in themselves, so trusting in their own possessions or in their own power, their own defenses, or in their alliances or in their other gods. But suddenly it will come upon them like labor pains, and they will have no one to turn to, even though they may cry out to these others for help. Okay, so this is the picture of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, that he looks the part and loves to appear to others as a great king, but is nothing of the sort. And in fact, that will be revealed even when he dies. Other people will recognize. Imagine you're one of those contractors that did a renovation for Jehoiakim, and he never paid you. And so when Jehoiakim dies, you think, good riddance, man. That guy was a liar and a terrible king. And so he will not even receive honor from his own people when he dies. Okay, comments or questions? Okay, great, thanks. We'll move on here to the next section and finish out chapter 22, reading verse, I think those verses are wrong. I forgot to change those over. So 24 to 30 here. And remember, Coniah is the same as Jeconiah, which is the same as Jehoiachin, the son of Jehoiakim. And he receives the message here in chapter 22, verse 24 to 30. As I live, declares the Lord, even though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, wore a signet ring on my right hand, yet I would pull you off, and I will give you over into the hand of those who are seeking your life, yes, into the hand of those whom you dread, even the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of the Chaldeans. I will hurl you and your mother, who bore you, into another country where you were not born, and there you will die. But as for the land to which they desire to return, they will not return to it. Is this man Coniah a despised, shattered jar, or is he an undesirable vessel? Why have he and his descendants been hurled out and cast into a land that they had not known? O land, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, write this man down childless, a man who will not prosper in his days. For no man of his descendants will prosper, sitting on the throne of David or ruling again in Judah. Okay, so this is the son of Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, as he's called by his kingly name. And the message for him, remember, he's very briefly on the throne. Look at your chart. 3 months, Jehoiachin or Coniah reigns, and he is taken off in the second wave by Nebuchadnezzar into Babylonian captivity. And the message for him is that God is going to do away with him. Maybe this is the immediate prophecy. So maybe we fast forwarded here just to the point where Jehoiachin is taken over as king, and this is a prophecy of what's going to happen. Maybe he's just been taken, and so this is the commentary that God is providing on him being taken into captivity. But he says, even if he were, which you know that these are not good kings. They don't stand out as being faithful to God. But God says, even if he were this royal signet ring, okay? Rings are important in general. There's something in my family with me and my brothers about losing rings at weddings or before weddings. It's kind of odd how that happened. No one likes to lose a ring of precious value. Trust us when we say that. But especially for a king, that ring is not just valuable, but that ring is a stamp of his authority. So there's really nothing more important, from a jewelry standpoint, I guess, than that signet ring. But God says, even still, even if he had that much precious value, what's he going to do with it? He's going to rip off the ring, and he's going to throw it away and cast it into the land of Babylon, to the land of their enemies, to the land of these pagans. And that's where Coniah, where Jehoiachin is going, just one of rejection, the land, one of abandoning him over to the Babylonians, and he will not return, the text says. But more than that, in the rest of this, I mean, it's not just you yourself are going to be thrown out. He says, this is it. And will not have a son to sit on the throne, he says. Write him down childless. Now, I don't think this means, in fact, it doesn't mean, and we'll see why in just a second. This doesn't mean that he's not going to have any children at all, literally have no children. But for a king, right, your children are your successor on the throne after you. That's the point here, is that your son will not sit on the throne after you. And furthermore, he says, let this sink in, no man of his descendants will prosper. Sitting is the end of the line, God says. Kind of culminating the message for the kings is, you guys have not been the kings like David. You have not lived up the standard that he set. You have ruled in injustice and unrighteousness and oppression, and so no more. Line of David is cut off. No more kings to sit on the throne. Okay, is there a problem with this? There's something that's uneasy about this prophecy here, that none of Jehoiachin's descendants will sit on the throne? In the immediate sense, you can see how this kind of plays out, because you'll remember that after Jehoiachin is taken into captivity, it's not his son that sits on the throne, it is his uncle. Mattaniah, then named Zedekiah, will become king. And so you can see in the immediate context, okay, Jehoiachin doesn't have a son on the throne. It's given to somebody else. But you go read in the first chapter of Matthew, it is from Jehoiachin, going back through Jehoiakim and Josiah and the other kings of Judah, it is through him that eventually we come to the lineage of Jesus of Nazareth, who is the Messianic king and the fulfillment of the prophecy of the forever king that will sit on the throne of David. Okay, so what do we make of all of this? And I'm not really sure, to be honest, okay? There's an argument to be made for the fact that, well, Jesus will be a different kind of king. And so, that's the prophecy is saying there won't be a king in the sense that we've had kings, reigning in Jerusalem up to this point. That could be. There's an argument to be made for that. But I think you could also say or make another argument, which is that what we're seeing here is similar to the language we see in the prophets and even in Jeremiah when he says that the land it'll be a complete destruction, right? Remember that language would be a complete destruction of Jerusalem or of Judah. The people will be completely wiped out. It said there's a totality there. There's a finality there. But then there are other passages that say, well, not a complete destruction because there will be a remnant that's left, right? That there's always, with the punishment God brings, he comes behind it, right? And he has mercy. And he is able to still find a way to fulfill his promises, even when a certain thing has been cut off or destroyed. And I think that may be what's happening here with the line of the kings of Judah. That they get to a point where God says, no, we're done. We're finished. It's all over. The kings are cut off. But we know that later in the story that mercy will be shown to the line of David. In fact, in Chronicles, if I'm not mistaken, maybe it's in Kings, I forget which one. And maybe we may get this in Jeremiah. I can't remember. This is all such great, precise information here. What we have in the historical record is that Jehoiachin is in captivity, and at some point in captivity, he is actually brought up, and he is given a seat at the table of the king of Babylon, and he is fed meals in abundance for the rest of his life. And that seems to be a sign of mercy being shown to this king of Judah, through whom will come, the Messiah eventually, as God is working this out. So I would say that there is a cutting off here. There is a punishment, but then later on, God will have mercy. In fact, notice this passage. Remember that God said in Jeremiah 22 that Jehoiachin is a signet ring that will be taken off and hurled into Babylon? Well, when the people do return from Babylon, they are led by a man named Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the son of the son of Jehoiachin. Okay, so Zerubbabel is in the line of the kings of Judah. And this is the message in the book of Haggai for Zerubbabel. Speak to him saying, I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. Okay, God's going to do something big. He's going to shake things up, overthrow the thrones of kingdoms and destroy the power of the kingdoms of the nations. I will overthrow the chariots and their riders, and the horses and their riders will go down, everyone by the sword of another. Listen to this. On that day, declares the Lord, I will take you, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, remember, descendant of Jehoiachin. I will take you, my servant, declares the Lord, and I will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts. I think what's happening is that in Haggai, God is coming back to Zerubbabel as things are being restored in the land, and he says to Zerubbabel, I'm doing something bigger than what you can imagine. It's not really just about coming back into the land of Judah and rebuilding the temple and getting things set up here. I'm about to shake heaven and earth and do huge things, right? Bigly things. And when I do that, you're going to be at the center of that. You will be the signet ring. I'm choosing you. And the same way that he cast off his ancestor, I'm choosing you. And we know then that from Zerubbabel, through his line, the Messiah comes and fulfills all those promises made about the throne of his father David. As Romans chapter 1 says, Jesus is declared to be, or proven to be, the son of David according to the flesh, and the son of God according to the power of the resurrection. Okay, so I think that's what's going on here. That's a common message that we see in books like Jeremiah, that God is cutting off his people. It's over, right? Think about Jeremiah 30 that we'll get to later on in our class, right? The old covenant is broken, cut off, done. But then there's a new covenant where God can fulfill his promises. And so the lines of Judah are cut off. Line of the king of Judah is cut off. But the sword that was broken shall be reforged, and there will be a king again that sits on David's throne and rules over his people. And it is, as we mentioned before, of course, in a different way than what people were expecting or were looking for. But still, Jesus fulfills all of those promises made to David and to David's household. Okay, that was probably way too long on finishing up that lesson. But hey, we'll make the best of it, and if we need to use Wednesday to finish this lesson, then we'll do that. So we're on now number 20, if you have your handout for that. And I think actually, even if we just get through this first section in chapter 23, this may be perfect. Maybe this is the way I should have organized it to begin with. But the first section of chapter 23 really makes the points that we've been making, and it really is its own answer. As many minutes as I wasted trying to give an answer to the end of chapter 22, really all you had to do was just read the first 8 verses of chapter 23. So keep in mind that the prophecy of cutting off the line after Jeconiah that ended chapter 22, chapter 23 verse 1 says, "Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Therefore, thus says the Lord God of Israel concerning the shepherds who are tending my people. You have scattered my flock and driven them away, and have not attended to them. Behold, I am about to attend to you for the evil of your deeds, declares the Lord. Then I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them and bring them back to their pasture, and they will be fruitful and multiply. I will also raise up shepherds over them, and they will tend them, and they will not be afraid any longer, nor be terrified, nor will any be missing, declares the Lord. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king, and act wisely, and do justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And this is the name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when they will no longer say, as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up and led back the descendants of the household of Israel from the northland and from all the countries where I have driven them. then they will live on their own soil. Okay, so there you go. There's your answer, which we'll talk about in a second concerning the branch of David. But still, this, I think, is continuing the context of chapter 22, where God is rebuking the shepherds. Now, remember, we've seen the language of shepherds before in Jeremiah. It's a pretty common image in the prophets. Some of the more famous passages, Ezekiel 34, Zechariah 11, and then Jesus picks up on all of this, and in John chapter 10 talks about the bad shepherds that he's come to replace. But the shepherds are the leaders of the people. So we've just been talking about kings with Zedekiah, and then going back in time to Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin. So the kings are in view, I think, here. But more generally, we've also seen that priests and prophets and other princes, rulers, are all included when Jeremiah talks about the shepherds of Israel. And what are the shepherds doing? Well, they're kind of acting like wolves more than they're acting like shepherds, right? They're devouring, they're destroying the flock, and scattering them. The very things that a shepherd is not supposed to do. The shepherd is supposed to attend to the flock. That's actually the language that God uses. And he has a nice play on words here that says, you have not been attending to the flock. Well, I'm going to attend to you. Maybe we would say, I'm going to take care of you because you haven't been taking care of the flock that you've been entrusted with. And so, not only will God bring punishment on these shepherds, but God is also going to act on behalf of his sheep, on behalf of his people, and he will gather the flock himself. And you see this, if you go read in Ezekiel chapter 34, you see some of this kind of crossing over of imagery here, right? Where on one hand, just to use Jeremiah 23, our text here, as the example, he says, I myself will gather them. But then he says, I will appoint good shepherds over them. And then he comes back in a second and says that he's going to have this descendant of David, right, that's going to rule, be the shepherd over the people, right? So is it God who's being the shepherd? Is it shepherds? Is it one shepherd? And some of that kind of vagueness, I think, is what we see when we're making these prophecies of what God's going to do in the time of the Messiah, right? But the point is that God's going to solve the problem. He's going to gather the people. By the way, this is interesting to me. I couldn't pass it up. He's going to gather them from where he's driven them, bring them back, and they will be fruitful and multiply. Well, what does that remind you of? Okay, that's the language of Genesis 1. That's the original kind of command, the blessing to humanity. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And so I wonder if again, we're looking forward in this passage to a time where God will fulfill that great blessing that he originally promised to humanity in Genesis chapter 1. Now that will be restored. Okay, but he says he will put shepherds over the people so that now, instead of being scattered and destroyed, they will be safe and they will be secure in the fold of God. And that then brings us to this prophecy of the branch. Also a very familiar prophetic image, the branch. It's not always the same word that's used in Hebrew, but here at least, this word for branch may be better translated like a shoot, okay? That's really the picture. And again, think back to what we said at the end of chapter 22, and fitting this together with the punishment, the cutting off of the line of kings that was just prophesied about Jeconiah. Okay, this is the image of the prophets. Go read a passage like Isaiah chapter 11. We see it here too. The picture is of a tree that has been cut down. It's been cut down. It's felled, right? And all there is remaining is a stump. Okay. But from that stump, after a while, there's a little shoot that starts popping up. and that is this branch that God refers to here. The branch that is raised up from David, okay? Again, a shoot out of dry ground is I think the language of Isaiah 53, but in Isaiah chapter 11, there is that branch from the stem of Jesse that's going to come up, and this is how God is going to ultimately fulfill the promise he made to David. But notice that this is the answer. This is the solution. Okay, think about all the things that were said back in chapter 22 about the bad kings, the bad shepherds. He, the branch, the Messiah, will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness. He will be the king that God always wanted for his people. And because, we'll notice that in a second. Because of his good kingship, the people, again, will be safe and secure. But notice in verse 6 as well, that his name, the name of this king, he is the branch of the line of David, and this great king will be called by a name, and the name is the Lord our righteousness. Okay? His name is the Lord our righteousness. Now, people had names that were statements about God, so just because you have a name, that is about God, doesn't necessarily mean you're calling yourself divine. But from what we know, isn't it interesting that the name of this shepherd is the Lord, our righteousness? There's also a little bit of a play on words here, because the name Zedekiah means like righteousness is the Lord's or something like that. Those two words of Jehovah and righteousness are put together to make Zedekiah. And so in a similar way, this king, his name is the Lord our righteousness. He's the king that Zedekiah obviously failed to be. Zedekiah being the last king, representative of all the failed kings that came before him. And this new king will not be that. He will be righteous. He will be just. But he won't just be the branch of David. He will also be God himself. I almost mentioned it and caught myself, but to make this point, Ezekiel 34. That's part of the overlapping of imagery in Ezekiel 34, that God says David will be the shepherd, right? There's bad shepherds, and so I'm going to get rid of the bad shepherds, and David will be their shepherd, meaning the son of David. And then later on, he comes back and says, I will be their shepherd. Well, which is it, God? Or is the son of David going to be the shepherd, or is God going to be the shepherd? And in Jesus, we see both of those completely fulfilled. God in the flesh, son of David according to the flesh, son of God as well, as Romans says, declared that or shown to be that by the power of the resurrection. And through him, he will reign over his people with justice and righteousness and fulfill the blessing promised not only to David, but promised to Abraham and promised to all of humanity from the beginning. Okay, and that is really the great deliverance that God will bring. 7 and 8 is a little bit, not confusing, but we're wanting to know how it fits here. He has said this before, by the way, in chapter 16. God has said this exact same thing. People aren't going to remember the Exodus from Egypt anymore as much as they will remember this new Exodus when the people come back from Babylon, right? But again, we need to recognize that in the prophets, the prophecies of return from Babylon, they find their ultimate fulfillment in what God's going to do after the return from Babylon, when the Messiah comes, when Jesus comes on the scene. And so, remember, we just saw that prophecy about Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, you're the signet ring. Well, did God mean that he was fulfilling all these promises in Zerubbabel himself? No. Zerubbabel was a sign of the greater fulfillment coming in Jesus, right, who would come from his line and be that king. And so when the prophets talk about you will return from captivity, you will dwell safe and secure in the land, and all these wonderful things that will happen after captivity, we should know that is really looking ahead to the time of the Messiah. And you know that when the people come back from the captivity and are actually living in the land again, things are not all that the prophets had made them out to be in that immediate context. They were still ruled by foreign nations. They were still weak and helpless and really very quickly corrupted by sin, even among their leadership. And so the return from Babylon is not just about that return itself in the days of Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, and so on. It's about the deliverance that is coming after that when the Messiah comes. And put that together with the language of the Bible, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 12 and all the way forward to Revelation chapter 20, right? That what is the great evil of man, of humanity? It is Babylon. Babylon is representative of sin, of the domain of the evil one, and how all of humanity has gathered together in rebellion against God. That's Babylon. That's why that imagery is used in the book of Revelation. And so God is, yes, going to bring his people back from Babylon in about 70 years so they can live in Judah again, those who choose to do that. But ultimately, God in the Messiah, the son of David, the branch that it grows forth from the stump that was once cut down, he will deliver his people from Babylon, from sin, and from the power of the evil one, and bring that deliverance that will be far more glorious than the deliverance of his people from Egypt. And that's what we give God the glory for. Yes, we give God glory for parting the Red Sea and leading the people out of Egypt, but what we give him glory for far beyond that, and what we remember when we meet every first day of the week is to give God glory for delivering us from sin and from the power of the evil one. So that is the great deliverance that is accomplished by God through Jesus, who is the Lord our righteousness and the branch from the line of David. Okay, well, we kind of milked that section a little more than I intended because that's I figured was the last thing that we should do. You see in verse 9 that we're transitioning a little bit to talk again about the false prophets that we've mentioned before, but now they're going to get like 31 verses devoted to them. And so we will just hold off on that and complete the rest of this lesson, number 20, on Wednesday and talk about Jeremiah 23, 9 to 40, and the message that God has for the false prophets and what it means to be a true prophet of God. So tune back in for that. It's good to see everybody this morning. Glad you could join us for worship and Bible class. Don't forget Zoom opportunities for kids' classes this afternoon, Acts class tomorrow night, and then we'll see you back here Wednesday night at 7:30 for the continuation of our Jeremiah class. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.